When I moved to Virginia almost 11 years ago now, I was welcomed with open arms into a collegial group of fellow ministers and other religious professionals. Being part of such a group is important for us because it's a matter of self-care, because we all need a support system with peers who experience many of the same joys and challenges and can offer empathy accordingly. Now, this collegial group was known as the Virginia Cluster of UU Ministers, or, since we UUs do love our acronyms, VACUUM. I must say it's not the worst name out there. I recently learned of a UU group in Ohio whose name, if you put together the initials of all the cities where there are congregations, comes out to be Wacky. Our beloved elder and fifth-generation Universalist, the late Reverend David Hicks McPherson, never liked the name Vacuum, and for that matter, it wasn't an accurate name either. Not all of Virginia was included, given that Northern Virginia congregations are in a different region for some reason, and the group had long included religious educators, community chaplains, and other religious professionals too. So a name change was in order, and earlier this year we decided to rename ourselves the Joseph Jordan Cluster of UU Religious Professionals, which doesn't have an acronym you can simply say out loud, but that's fine. Call it the Joseph Jordan Cluster for short. Let me clarify a couple of things. First, this is not a group of UU congregations. The Tidewater Cluster for congregations in Fredericksburg, Glen Allen, Richmond, Williamsburg, Whitestone, and Virginia Beach, and the UUFP, and the Blue Ridge Cluster for congregations on the western side of the state, they still exist. The Joseph Jordan Cluster is a group of UU religious professionals. Second, what I'm pronouncing as Jordan is actually spelled Jordan. And that's because it's named after a Universalist minister whose name was spelled Jordan and pronounced Jordan. Much of what we know about Joseph Jordan is thanks to the late Willard Frank, professor of history at Old Dominion University and member of what was then the Unitarian Church of Norfolk for more than 50 years. Some of Frank's research concerned our religious history, in the course of which he organized 2 conferences and coordinated several programs on African-American Universalism. There's a special collection at ODU of Frank's research documents in this regard, and it is truly extensive. The ODU library catalog says that it's more than 38 shelf feet in length. It does not include, unfortunately, any of Joseph Jordan's own writings, nor even a picture of him, since none are known to exist. So primary sources include the Universalist publications of the time, as well as the records of the Universalist General Convention. Frank used these to write Joseph Jordan's biography, and you can find it online on the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography, as well as in Mark Morrison Reed's book, Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism. We heard one version of Jordan's biography from Joanne earlier in the service, so let me recap. Joseph Jordan was born a free black man in West Norfolk in 1842. He learned to read and write, and with his ingenuity, entrepreneurial spirit, and lots of hard work, he went from oysterman to skilled carpenter, becoming a property owner, an ordained Baptist minister, and a community leader in Norfolk. By then, the Civil War had ended slavery, but African Americans were still not truly free. And it was not uncommon for Black Baptist ministers to preach on the sinfulness of white oppressors who would surely be punished by God in hell. Then, in the mid-1880s, Jerdan received a copy of Thomas Whitmore's The Plain Guide to Universalism. And in that book, he found a theology that emphasized the final holiness and happiness of all people, that proclaimed God's love extending to everyone without exception. Wanting to learn more, Jerdan went to Philadelphia, where he spent several months at the Universalist Church of the Messiah, learning from the congregation and its minister. Returning to Norfolk, Jerdan preached Universalism to a group of 20 families. They rented a room on Lincoln Street as a chapel, and Jerdan used his own carpentry skills to fashion the pulpit, as well as other furniture. Parents asked Jerdan for a school to teach their children, since public education did not extend to African-American families. They wanted to give their children better opportunities in the world, and Jerdan agreed to do that as part of the Universalist mission. In 1888, the Universalist General Convention issued Jerdan an official license to preach, and the following year, a committee of 3 ministers and 4 lay people made a unanimous recommendation that Jerdan be ordained, the first African-American Universalist minister so recognized. His congregation was welcomed by the denomination too, and soon Lincoln Street carried a new sign with the name, the First Universalist Church of Norfolk. When the congregation outgrew that rented room, Jerdan appealed to the Universalist General Convention for funds for their own building. His appeal was successful, and soon First Universalist had a new building, including a sanctuary and a church school on Princess Anne Avenue. Jerdan and his assistant, Howard University graduate Thomas E. Wise, followed the philosophy of W.E.B. Du Bois with education as the essential route to empowerment, dignity, and purpose. That the Norfolk School was teaching up to 100 children each week was noticed by African-American leaders in Suffolk, and soon Wise was leading a new Universalist church with a school there too. Wise himself was ordained, the second African-American Universalist minister, and Jerdan preached the ordination sermon. Jerdan died in 1901, not quite 60, probably of the tuberculosis that claimed the lives of his wife and son the following year. It left Wise as minister and school principal in both Norfolk and Suffolk, and soon there was another school in Ocean View too. The Universalist General Convention used the proceeds from Jerdan's estate to support the growing school in Suffolk, which thrived even as First Universalist in Norfolk and its school declined. They closed in 1906. Under the leadership of the third African-American Universalist minister, Joseph Fletcher Jordan, who was not related to Joseph Jerdan, his wife, Mary J. Jordan, and then their daughter, Annie B. Willis, the Suffolk School continued to educate generations of African-American children through the 1980s. In Darkening the Doorways, Mark Morrison Reed asks why, given its radically egalitarian message, Universalism didn't take stronger root in African-American communities. He calls it Universalism's theological conundrum, that the faith was never adequately able to address the meaning of African-American suffering. Approaching suffering from a universalist perspective, Morrison Reed writes, leads us to a quandary. If, as the Universalists claim, all are ultimately saved, why have African Americans been singled out? In the Universalist context, Their suffering had no special meaning, nor is it given particular justification. It is not necessary for one's salvation, yet it exists. One conclusion was reached by writer and activist James Baldwin. God, he wrote in The Fire Next Time, is white. If his love was so great, and if he loved all his children, why were we, the blacks, cast down so far? Or, as African-American UU theologian William R. Jones asks in the title of his book, is God a white racist? Rather, it's understandable that the Black Baptist ministers of Joseph Jordan's time, for that matter our own time too, would preach about white sinfulness, comforting their congregants with the idea that they would be rewarded for their suffering in heaven, while their white oppressors would be punished in the eternal fires of hell. And unless you believe that all of our Universalist forebears of Jordan's time were as enlightened as those who welcomed him and mentored him and supported him and raised money for him, well, that was unfortunately not the case. In 1903, several influential leaders pressured the Universalist General Convention to investigate the Hampton Roads congregations and the ability of Thomas Wise to lead them. Never mind that their cost to the denomination was a mere few $100s, as contrasted with much greater subsidies provided to foreign missions. The commission charged with this investigation did not include any representative from Virginia. It decided that only the Suffolk school should remain open and that it should follow the trade-oriented educational philosophy of Booker T. Washington, as practiced at the Hampton Institute, rather than the empowering philosophy of W.E.B. Du Bois that Wise followed and that Jordan had preferred. Actually, it's no small matter that the Suffolk school was allowed to continue. One of the commissioners was a Washington, D.C. minister, John Van Scoit Jr., who opposed African-American Universalism, though he used a much less PC word than African-American, and explicitly argued for the social, economic, physical, and moral superiority of white people over black people. The year after the commission's decision, Thomas Wise resigned from his position and left Universalism altogether. Some of the remaining members of First Universalist went with him to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and there are very few records of him after that. As I said earlier, we don't have any of Joseph Jordan's own writings, none of his sermons, none of his letters. We don't know how he responded to Universalism's theological conundrum, how he made meaning of black suffering in the context of, really in spite of, an all-loving God. Jordan's Universalism was obviously strongly practical in that he saw educating African-American children as an essential part of empowering them and their communities. But we don't have much more evidence of how he understood this faith, even though the committee that recommended his ordination verified his universalism not merely as a profession of belief, but as a foundation of practice. Perhaps we can find some clue in what appealed to Jordan and convinced him to become a Universalist. That was when he read Thomas Whitmore's book, The Plain Guide to Universalism. And it's interesting to read that book for ourselves now, given that our idea of what might be called classical universalism is that it's simply a belief in universal salvation, that nobody goes to hell and everyone goes to heaven. In fact, Whitmore dismissed defining universalism only in terms of universal salvation. An attempt has been recently made to distinguish Universalists only by a disbelief in future punishment, he wrote. Such an attempt is unjustifiable. Universalists agree in the great doctrine of the final holiness and happiness of all people, and they leave every person to form their own opinion in regard to the times and seasons when this great event shall transpire. Rather, Whitmore defined universalism repeatedly as the belief in the eventual holiness and happiness of all the human race. This was something that surely appealed to Joseph Jordan, not in terms of speculation over the nature of a hereafter, but in the hope freely available to everyone that humanity could be holy and happy. Perhaps the answer to universalism's theological conundrum lies not in trying to understand the arguably absurd idea that white oppressors and oppressed people of color would be equally rewarded in heaven, that white supremacists like Van Scoit would not be punished for the harm they had done. Perhaps the answer lies in seeing that the eventual holiness and happiness of all the human race is something that could happen in this life. That yes, people are horribly flawed. And yes, some people are the cause of terrible suffering in other people. But that it doesn't have to be this way. That there is always the possibility of humanity's salvation. Universalism as a practiced religion in Hampton Roads did not outlive its first generation of African-American ministers. Mark Morrison Reed notes many reasons for this, including theology, demographics, and prejudice. We can certainly honor Joseph Jordan for being, as Morrison Reed puts it, a Black pioneer in a white denomination. And we can celebrate his valiant effort to share the good news of universalism beyond its traditionally white borders. But the fact is that you don't even need all of your fingers on both hands to count the number of African-American ministers on either Universalist or Unitarian sides before the 1961 consolidation. Our history doesn't limit us, of course, but we can't forget it. We owe it to Jordan to remember him and Wise and Jordan and Willis. And we owe it to them to remember Van Scoit and his Universalist and Unitarian ilk for the damage they did, for actually preventing each denomination from doing what was right, even by their own standards of the time. Their stories are part of our story, and those stories continue to shape who we are today, even if we don't realize it, and especially if we don't know them. In our own time, of course, we are in the midst of a racial reckoning, not just in the United States, but within Unitarian Universalism too. We are being asked to face reality head on, to recognize not just the parts of ourselves and our history that we like, but also the parts that make us uncomfortable, that upset us. Thanks to our study of widening the circle of concern, we've been learning about restoration and reparations, what those actually mean, and what they might look like. There's much more to this than I can say in the last minute of a sermon, but I wonder, knowing what did happen to universalism in Hampton Roads, if part of reconciling ourselves to this history could come from asking what could happen with universalism in Hampton Roads. After all, I'm pretty sure that none of my colleagues actually preach that everyone goes to a literal heaven after death. If Whitmore is to be believed, that was never universalism anyway. But the hope freely available to everyone that humanity could be holy and happy, well, as one of my mentors put it, that'll preach. Recognizing that people are horribly flawed, And yes, some people are the cause of terrible suffering in other people, but that it doesn't have to be this way, well, that would be refreshingly honest. And acknowledging that if we were willing to do the work, if we were willing to hold one another and ourselves accountable, if we were willing to talk to one another about what really matters, then wholeness and holiness and happiness are possible. Then humanity's salvation might not be so out of reach. That's the universalism that could thrive here. All of us together, loving the hell out of this world. May it be so.